Manever I say ma PENDREAM TV. PENDREAM TV there, I see them yopo.
Well, I believe we are specifically discussing the forum which took place yesterday.
Yes, and the statement that was made by the former vice president of the Islamic University.
Yes. I mean, the forum was by all standards impressive. It was carried live on Pan-African television as well as Telesur in Caracas. And Telesur covers almost the whole of South America. So even though the forum was held at the Freedom Center in Accra, it was a forum which was watched around the world, and that was very significant. The other significant thing is that Yuri Pimentel, who is the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of Venezuela, actually took part in this forum by video connection. And there were all kinds of people from all the political parties in Ghana and all the broad-based social movements also in the country. They all took part in this forum. And this is a reflection of the depth of concern of the Ghanaian people about what is happening in Caracas. I am becoming deeply worried by what is happening. Indeed, what is happening in Caracas is perhaps the worst form of colonialism. The demands of the US are simply outrageous. One of the demands is that the major national resource of Venezuela, which is oil, should be put under the direct control of the US president. I mean, where does this happen? That one country's national resources should be put under the direct control of another country's president. It's unbelievable, but this is the demand. Number two, the US is demanding that Venezuela should cut off all economic relations with Russia, China, and Iran. I mean, it's preposterous in the extreme. And Cuba. So the US now is demanding that it should be in charge of the foreign policy of an independent sovereign state. Unbelievable. Completely unbelievable. You know, and there are other such outrageous demands. Now, be that as it may, there's also been a lot of lies. A lot of lies have been spread about what is happening in Caracas. And one of those is the lie that his own bodyguards betrayed him and that they were bribed by the intelligence services of the United States of America to betray him. Now, the purpose of that lie is to falsely create the impression that Maduro had no support. Because even if his own bodyguard could betray him, then he had no support, then he's very weak and so on, and therefore justifies the US action. The facts are different. One, there was heavy resistance from his bodyguards, leading to a situation in which 80 of his bodyguards were killed by the invading forces, 80 of them. These 80 bodyguards of Maduro who were killed by the invading forces included 32 Cuban internationalists were killed. So it cannot be true. The US has itself admitted that many of its special forces suffered varying degrees of injury. And as we speak, some of them are in critical condition in US hospitals. In addition to that, there is also confirmation that at least one US helicopter was shot in the confrontation. So that is a lie. It's not true. Now, there are many interesting aspects of this whole, standoff and so on. And one is the very interesting statement which was made by President Donald Trump. When asked if the Venezuelan opposition would take over the leadership of the country, he said two things. One, that the Venezuelan opposition has no respect in Venezuela, the people of Venezuela, do not respect the opposition leaders, especially Machado, who was only recently given a Nobel Prize. This is Donald Trump. Says they have no respect. The Venezuelans don't respect them. Then he made a second point, that they don't have the competencies to run Venezuela. Now, this is the U.S. who has always argued that Maduro lost the elections to the opposition. Now, if the people of Venezuela, according to him, do not respect the opposition, how do they vote for the opposition to beat Maduro in the election? And if he's convinced that they don't have the competencies to run Venezuela, what is this hue and cry over the opposition having lost an election and therefore it's legitimate for the opposition to take over power? To run Venezuela again? It simply doesn't make any sense at all. Now, for me, the other situation simply is that in spite of the kidnapping or abduction of Nicolas Maduro, his government remains intact. His government still controls majority of the seats in parliament. Vast majority of the seats in parliament is in the hands of the Maduro government. Indeed, the Supreme Court of Venezuela has just sworn in Maduro's vice as the interim president, and it is obvious that they are in control. Now, what is also interesting is that the streets of Venezuela are dominated by Chavistas. They have taken control of the streets completely. The opposition tried to organize a demonstration in which only about 300 or so people showed up. They cannot mobilize people onto the streets. So the streets are also in the hands of the Maduro forces and so on. Now, significantly, the interim president, who used to be vice president of Maduro, has said that as far as Venezuela is concerned, Maduro remains the president of Venezuela, and that they would not succumb to colonization from the U.S. and so on. So the stand of the Venezuelan government is also absolutely clear. Now, a few other things are worthy of mention, which is the solidarity that Venezuela is receiving from South American or Latin American countries. Indeed, almost all of them, with the exception of one, have declared full solidarity with Venezuela. And indeed, yesterday, 6 of them issued a joint statement calling for the immediate release of Maduro and describing what had happened as illegal and so on. This is Latin America, this is South America, and so on. Now, interestingly, yesterday, Donald Trump called the president of Colombia and changed his tone completely, and is now inviting the president of Colombia to the White House for discussion, for conversation. Now, he has been threatening the president of Colombia. He's been threatening the president of Colombia that what happened to Maduro would happen to him if he does not support the U.S. kidnapping of a sitting president of Caracas. So now he's changed completely. Why has he changed? Because it's obvious that they are losing the plot. You understand? They are losing the plot. Yesterday, Donald Trump announced that billions of barrels of Venezuelan oil will be handed over to the U.S. and that if sold, he will control the money. Resources of Venezuela handed over to the U.S. for sale, and the president of the U.S. will control the money. Why does this happen? In any case, under law, under any law, both domestic and international law, that does not stand. Because any agreement which is procured under duress is null and void. And he's been threatening the leadership of Venezuela to hand in the oil or he will invade them. So that is obtaining that resource under duress. And it's a violation of both U.S. law, it's a violation of international law, and a violation of all laws. Now, the other thing which is also important and has been raised by Senator Bernie Sanders and others, even including some senators from the Republican Party, is that what happened in Caracas is a violation of U.S. law. Because under U.S. law, The president of the US cannot use American troops on a foreign land, cannot declare war without congressional approval. And this was done without congressional approval. There also appears to be a lot of confusion in the United States itself, in the political establishment of the United States, even in the Trump government. Trump is talking about money, how to make money for America, how to seize the oil resources of Venezuela and hand them over to American companies. His whole focus is on how to make money for America, how to steal resources and make money out of these resources. His Secretary of State is not talking about money. His Secretary of State, who is originally Cuban, is a Cuban, Cuban immigrant. He is talking about using Venezuela in order to crush Cuba. And he's saying it openly. He's saying that, look, Venezuela has been the only or perhaps the main supplier of fuel to Cuba. In fact, Cuba imports about 30,000 barrels of crude from Venezuela on a daily basis. And he's saying that if they can seize control of Venezuelan oil and prevent Venezuela from sending oil to Cuba, Cuba would automatically collapse and his purpose would have been achieved. So there's no policy coherence. No policy coherence. You understand? Absolutely no policy coherence in the Trump administration. Within 24 hours of the attempted invasion of Venezuela, there were demonstrations, pro-Venezuelan demonstrations in 75 cities in the United States of America. 75 cities in the United States of America. So a lot of Americans, many Americans, reject what their government has done. Now let's talk about the issues which are being raised against Maduro, and I'll just deal with two. One is narco trafficking. Of course, the records are clear. The United States is the biggest state which, on the basis of evidence and record, has been involved in narco trading. The Contra affair is clear. The Contra affair is clear. I mean, the U.S., supply drugs or put drugs on the international market in order to raise money to fund insurgency in Latin America. And that record is very clear. In fact, the rebels who supported in Iran actually were financed with narco money. This is official. The CIA was engaged in narco trafficking. So that is clear. You understand? The U.S. has been involved in narco trading. There's no evidence whatsoever linking Maduro to narco trading. No evidence. The U.S. has not been able to provide a shred of evidence linking Maduro to narco trading and so on. So that collapses, completely. Now, the initial charges which were preferred against Maduro were laughable. One of the charges was simply that Maduro was in possession of a machine gun. Can you believe this? The president of Venezuela was in possession of a machine gun, not in the United States, but in his palace. And that's a basis for arresting him and putting him on trial in the United States of America. I mean, that's crazy. Yeah. Whatever it is, the U.S. can only exercise the kind of control it wants over Venezuela if it can take over Venezuela. Donald Trump cannot run Venezuela sitting in Washington if he does not put troops on the ground in Venezuela. Now, I know Venezuela a bit, Even the geography of Venezuela is a challenge. The geography of Venezuela. Even Caracas. The geography of Caracas is a challenge. It's a mountainous, forested region. And to put troops on the ground to control Venezuela is an uphill task. The U.S. Army is not capable of doing that. In fact, Venezuela is far more complicated than Libya, which was a desert area. It's far more complicated than Vietnam, and so on. So to put troops on the ground is a major challenge for the U.S. They can't do it and succeed. And if they cannot do that and succeed, they cannot take control of Venezuela. Now, of course, they've annoyed all the forces in the world. China has been very, very strong on this matter. Russia has been very strong on this matter. Indeed, Ghana under President Dramani Mahama has taken a very firm stand on this matter. The AU statement is not that strong, but it's still opposed to what has happened in Venezuela. And it sees what has happened in Venezuela as a violation of international law and so on. Increasingly, the US is becoming isolated. Okay. Now, these are the kicks. What the US is doing are the kicks of a dying empire. And if you go through history, it's there. That is how Spain, as the dominant power in the world, collapsed. That is how Britain, which at a certain stage in history controlled 25% of the land area of the world, collapsed. And certainly, these are the signs that the US empire is about to collapse. What happened yesterday in the forum is perhaps one of the beginnings of many things that will happen throughout the world. Progressive forces are going to be meeting, to be discussing the issue, and to be strategizing about how to solidarize with the people and government of Venezuela. And I'm confident that ultimately victory will be on the side of the progressive forces.
There will be huge implications, and I'll come back for you to enumerate some of the implications. But Mr. London, you look at what happened, and I've been making this argument. Now it looks like it's a precedent that has been set by the US. Even Ghana can wake up one day, so to speak, and say, okay, I'm going to Togo. Togo, the Yadema is misbehaving. Let's go and capture him and bring him back. Is that a precedent that the US is setting? Looking at what is happening in the various countries that are just sitting by and watching.
Well, I mean, the US measures are aimed at China, Russia, and Iran in a certain way. I mean, the US wants to prevent the export of Venezuelan oil to China. It will not amount to much because China really is a huge country, and China's imports of oil from Venezuela are not that critical to the Chinese economy. But nonetheless, it's the principle. It's offensive for anybody to try to block supplies to China and also to Russia. Yesterday, there were reports that Russia had sent in its submarines to try and save a Venezuelan tanker which was being hijacked by the US. Somehow the US still managed to hijack the tanker. It is not known whether the Russian vessels did not arrive there in time or so. But that's a show of force. Russia is beginning to show that it may and can apply force, in order to protect its interests and also to protect its friends. So that is significant. As we do know, right now there are demonstrations across Iran which are believed to be instigated by the Mossad and Western intelligence agencies. And yesterday it got violent. Some of the protesters took up weapons. And the demonstrations spread from the cities to the villages and so on. Now, the US is threatening to also launch a war on Iran. And it appears that the demonstrations are a precursor to a US invasion or US bombing of Iran. So you put all of that together. Now, US is also claiming, it's saying that it wants to buy Greenland. And if Denmark does not sell Greenland, it will take it by force of arms. So US is actually threatening to wage war with its allies in NATO. So imagine a situation where there's war in Iran, there's war in Venezuela, there's war in China, and so on. What kind of picture are you getting? You understand? Now, China is a nuclear-armed country. Don't forget it. I mean, you saw the recent display of Chinese, firepower and so on. And you saw those missiles which China displayed. You understand? Those missiles also include hydrogen bombs. And China is the only country in the world which has hydrogen bombs. China has the capacity to hit any part of the world, and I mean any part of the world, in the maximum of 20 minutes. China has the capacity to obliterate the United States of America. So this recklessness by the Trump administration can have exceedingly devastating consequences for the world. Now, if you bear in mind the fact that between Russia, we're just talking about Russia, we are not adding China, we are not adding North Korea. Between Russia and the United States of America, they have the capacity, the nuclear capacity, to destroy the world 10 times over. I mean, one destruction leaves us nothing. One destruction leaves us nothing. So can you imagine 10 times total destruction? So that is what the US appears to be caught in. And it is reckless. It is completely insane. You can be pro-America, I don't care. You can support, you can be capitalist to the core, I don't care. That is not the issue. The issue now is that whether you're a Marxist or a capitalist or whatever, our world is facing for the first time clear possibility of total destruction. That is what we are facing. All of us will die. Civilization as we know it today will collapse forever. That is the reality. That's what we are facing. And that is why it is important for all forces of reason, all forces for peace and so on, to rally together to prevent the catastrophe that is looking us in the face.
Well, Mr. Landon, should we move on, or we want to chip in something?
I mean, try and explain something. You see, and there's a history. The history is long, so I'm not going to go into that history. But the history is long. I mean, the collapse of the Spanish Empire. Spain collapsed as an empire because it embarked on wars across the world, and it could no longer finance the wars. Okay, so it used to use the silver coin. It started adulterating the silver coin by putting copper in the silver coin, and its currency lost value. So Britain had a similar situation. So it's a long history. I'm not going to go into all of that. The fact of the matter is that the US dollar is no longer backed by gold. The US dollar used to be backed by gold. That is why it became the currency of preference for international trade. But for some time now, the US dollar is just mere paper, empty paper. It's not backed by anything. It's useless piece of paper. Okay. The US dollar continues to have relevance for international trade because of the concept of the petrodollar. The US entered an agreement with Saudi Arabia so that all Saudi oil is sold in dollars. And since every country buys petrol, it continues to maintain its relevance. Since then, the US has printed trillions of dollars which have no worth. Their only worth comes from the fact that it's the currency that you can use to buy oil. Now, that situation is changing. Now, Russia is selling its oil in yuan, not dollars. It's selling its oil in rupees, and so on. You understand? So, the dollar is in crisis. Venezuela has agreed to sell its oil in yuan, not dollars, to China, and also in rubles to Russia, and so on. So that again puts pressure on the US currency, and the other examples that he mentions, and so on. Now, the SWIFT system is no longer the only system for reference in international trade, and so on. The Russians are developing their own system, the Chinese have developed their own system, and so on. So the US is under threat. The US wants a situation where it can continue to just print paper without any value, and use that for international trade, and transfer its inflation to other countries. By so doing, it transfers its inflation to other countries like Ghana and so on. The inflation we suffer here, a lot of it is imported inflation from the United States and so on. So the US wants to maintain that order. And that is why it is misbehaving in Venezuela. But in addition to this, there is something else which is very, very, very significant. The U.S. has refineries, you understand, oil refineries. Somehow, the U.S. decided to build its refineries to process heavy crude oil, not light crude oil. Okay. Venezuela has the largest crude oil resources, proven crude oil resources in the world, but it is heavy. You understand? The U.S. can get its oil from Nigeria, you can get some from Saudi Arabia and so on. But that is sweet, light crude oil, which its refineries cannot efficiently process. So getting access to Venezuelan oil has become crucial for the survival of the U.S. oil industry. That's all the problems we are suffering. That's why all of this is happening. The U.S. recklessly built its refineries to process heavy crude because it believed that it will forever control Venezuela, that Venezuela will forever be under its thumb. You understand? The U.S. has oil, but it's also light. It's not heavy. You know, and then interestingly, Cuba has some small oil, which is also heavy. You know, so the heavy oil is actually in South America, and so on. Happily today, I've heard an announcement that Mexico is going to start supplying Cuba with oil, and therefore, whatever happens in Venezuela may not have that level of impact on Cuba. But of course, we know that they will soon attack Mexico too. If Mexico continues to supply oil to Cuba.
So, nowhere safe if Trump is in power. Somebody said that nowhere safe in the world when Trump is in power.
I mean, look, Trump says that he has an agenda to make America great again. Yeah? No problem with that. Every leader wants to make his country great again. The problem is that Trump's understanding of greatness is crazy. His understanding of greatness is the ability to bomb other countries, to steal their resources and so on. That's not how countries become great. Countries become great by solving the problems that confront their people, by making sure that their people can eat well, by making sure that the people have access to better health care, by improving education and so on. That is not the concern of Trump. Indeed, on the streets of New York, on the streets of Washington, are homeless people. People who cannot eat, who eat from trash cans. People who go to soap kitchens to survive and so on. If he can solve those problems, he would make America great again. The path he has taken would not make America great again. It will make America a laughingstock of the world. You understand? Look at the discrimination in the U.S. against Chicanos, against the Latinos, against the Africans and so on. End that discrimination, end racial discrimination in the U.S., and the U.S. will become great again. And all of us would admire the U.S. But the path he's trotting now is a reckless path to the destruction of the United States of America.
Right. Thankfully, in Ghana here, our leadership is thinking of how to make ethical leadership possible at all costs. So we turn our attention to Ghana, and yesterday the president, Mahamas and Nana Adjei-Adjei led administration, they turned 1 year. And for me, at the back of it, I celebrated the vice president because 1 year ago we voted in for the first female vice president of the Republic of Ghana, and that's a milestone we also need to add to the achievement that has been chalked by the Mahamas administration. I want to start off a scenario as that of questions, praises, and criticisms. You know, summing up how Ghanaians see the 1 year of Mahamas, administration. Where would you peg yours?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's important to make a point that this is 1 year out of a 4-year term, and that imposes upon us a responsibility to be cautious. Either way, there are 3 more years to go. This is 1 year. Now, anybody doing an honest evaluation of the last 1 year cannot be negative about the last 1 year. And I've seen the results of the survey carried out by the Global Info Analytics. And the president's approval rating is very close to 70%. I think it's 67%, very close to 70%. It seems to me that that's a true reflection of how the Ghanaian people feel about their president. You understand? Now, my brother Philip London is right. All over Nigeria, you go to their social media, you go to their regular media and so on, and you get the impression that Nigerians would actually have liked President Mahamas to be president of Nigeria. And they say it openly. They talk about his simplicity, and it's obvious. He's so very simple, easily approachable, and so on. And that impresses fellow West Africans a lot, more than the inflation rate and so on. His simplicity is something which greatly impresses, especially people in the West African region. Then there's also the question about his accessibility. And I've heard comments from all kinds of people who don't find it difficult to get access to him. You understand? I think that is also quite remarkable. And then also within the last 1 year, not much has changed in terms of policy direction. Because essentially we are implementing the same IMF program which Nana Akufo-Addo's government signed on to. But with prudence and more discipline, the results are different. Nobody could have imagined that within 12 months of anybody's administration, inflation will fall from 23% to 6%.
In fact, it's now 5.4.
Well, whatever it is, 5.4, 6%, it's within the same range.
Same bracket, right?
And that is remarkable. Remarkable, significant. If you look at the dollar rate, it climbed down from 17 to $1 to today, which is around less than 11 to $1. That's also quite remarkable. If you look at our national debt, the quantum of the national debt has also come down significantly. But I have always argued that these macroeconomic indicators don't tell the full story. In this particular case, there's a certain correlation between the macroeconomic indicators and the lives of the people. Price of maize is down. Price of fuel is down. Price of rice is down. You go to the market. Price of chicken is down. In fact, there's a glut on the egg market. There's so much eggs that the producers of eggs cannot sell them. So much eggs. You understand? So you can feel this in the marketplace. And so whatever we say, whatever we do, whatever our preferences are, there have been significant improvements in the countries. Okay. I'm worried by a few things. And one of the things is why we always celebrate national events and so on with a religious state. When indeed this is supposed to be a secular state. Why can't we have secular activities which must reflect the character of our state? Why should our leaders always impose their religion on the rest of us? That for me is a huge problem. Even if we want to do things in the religious vein and so on, why do we discriminate against other religions? Why is traditional religion not respected in our country and so on? Those are my very deep concerns, Look, in this country, we have Baha'is in this country. We have people from the Akumedi shrine in this country. We have Tigari people in this country. We have Christians in this country. We have Hindus in this country. In this country, you can count at least 60 different religions and so on. Now, religion is not about majority and minority. You don't vote on religion. It's about minority and minority. It's a fundamental right that everybody enjoys. Atheists are entitled to be atheists, even if they are 0.1% of the population. You understand? So I think that we should begin to debate this question of religious rights and so on. I think it's important that we begin to debate this question. The other thing that also, strikes me is just political parties and issues of governance. In the past, we elected people into government on the ticket of political parties, and the political parties stayed aloof or were dominated. Their views didn't count, and so on. Now, it is clear that the National Democratic Congress is not allowing the president to behave as he likes or to do as he likes. The National Democratic Congress on several occasions has tried to rein in the government. And I think that it's a major plus, when it comes to political parties and governance and so on. For example, this madness about campaigning for a third term for President Mahamas. The NDC has taken a very strong position, issued a very strong statement clarifying the situation. Only a week ago or so, the General Secretary of the party made the point that they would not tolerate sycophancy, and so on. Now, this is a party which is asserting itself. And I think that it is good for governance. So I think the NDC as a political party is behaving very, very well. You would also notice that all this clamor to replace John Mahama is gone down. Do you know why? Because the Council of Elders of the National Democratic Congress put his foot down and said anybody who misbehaves should be sacked and called them to order. Now there's some sanity, There's a party which is beginning to assert itself, a party which is beginning to insist that the executive came to power on its ticket and that the right things need to be done. So I'm very happy about the National Democratic Congress and so on. I'm quite happy about that. I'm also happy about something which some of the foot soldiers of the NDC are not happy about. Today, employment in the public sector, I think gradually we are moving to a stage where it is merit-based. Look at employment in the security services. It is advertised, people openly compete and so on. Before, there was no advertisement. By the time you realize the positions have been filled. Now there's open competition for employment into the security services and so on. And I'm very, very happy, about that. I'm exceedingly happy, about that. The other thing that I'm happy about is the fact that the government is not abusing its overwhelming majority in Parliament. And that is very significant. Look, given the majority of the government in Parliament, you can do practically anything or most things. And yet there have been instances where the minority has complained about issues and the government has withdrawn what it has taken to Parliament to go and rethink it. That's a responsible government which is not abusing its majority, and I'm very, very impressed, by that. Ultimately, the government has to change course. Ultimately, we need to have a new paradigm for national development. We need to abandon this neoliberal path to national development, which is reckless and so on. We need to abandon it, And I'm surprised that the so-called Constitutional Review Committee did not address itself to constitutional provisions which would guarantee a paradigm shift. For example, questions about who controls our natural resources. When we enter into negotiations with foreign entities and so on about our national resources, what should be the paradigm? What should be the guideline and so on? These are the most important things. Whether to add 1 year to the president's term and so on, what does it do to us? It's useless. It doesn't do anything to us. The fundamental thing is the control over our natural resources. And the Constitutional Review Committee did not look at that. All of us have come to the conclusion that African unity is absolutely important for the advancement of the African people, even in the diaspora. The Constitutional Review Committee did not touch on the question of African unity. In the 1960 Constitution, there's a provision in the Constitution which said that Ghana was ready to sacrifice its sovereignty for the collective sovereignty of Africa. It was there in the Constitution. The Constitutional Review Committee didn't see that as necessary and so on. So this has solved the problems. One of the other things which has been discussed a lot has been the role of the Office of Special Prosecutor. My position is that that office was set up to fail. Okay, ab initio, we knew that it was not going to do well. One, you set up an Office of Special Prosecutor to investigate corruption, graft, and so on. The number one controller of the national purse is the Minister of Finance. And yet, resources for the Office of Special Prosecutor needs to be approved and released by the Minister of Finance. What have you done? What have you done? You set up the Office of Special Prosecutor, which doesn't have any real power of investigation and prosecution. The power to prosecute is still vested in the Attorney General. So we messed the office up. And I am horrified by the personal attacks which have been heaped on Kwesi and so on, as if he's the problem. Kwesi is not the problem. You know, the law is the problem. The environment in which we put him is the problem. You know, it was a truly independent Office of Special Prosecutor with relevant resources. My take that is that it would have done well. You know, we deliberately set up this office to fail, and we are suffering the consequences.
So you rather suggest that we work around the office, make it more solid, not just the person in there, but the office reconstitutes the structure of the office.
If I wanted to say that, I would have said that. If you want to say that, please say that.
No, I wanted to get a clearer understanding.
No, what you mean is that you're trying to get me to say what you want to say, and it will not happen.
All right, okay. I believe you've landed, so we can look at the NPP's camp, and then maybe because of time, we spend about 10 minutes to look at the NPP. Because there are some issues in, they are going to Congress soon. They are going to elect their flag bearer for the next elections, and one camp seems to be in trouble. The Dombo family seems to be rejecting Brian Champon. It says that the family is not behind Brian Champon, but rather they've thrown their weight behind a credible candidate. That's what they are saying, in the person of the former Vice President, Alhaji Bawumia, Dr. Alhaji Bawumia.
Well, I'm completely scandalized by this development, because the message out there is that in the NPP, leadership is a dynasty. You know, it's worrying, that's the message. What is the Dombo family, or any other family for that matter, when it comes to the question of selecting the leadership of a political party? It's not a dynasty, you understand? And I feel completely scandalized that in 2026, politicians in Ghana are behaving as if, they are living in the Ottoman Empire, in the era where, the era of the divine rule of kings and so on. It's so embarrassing, Now, listen, let's talk reality. Our own first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, even his children do not agree in politics. They support different political parties, they have different perspectives and so on. We take Buzia, the Prime Minister of the Progress Party, the UP party in 1969. Take his children. They do not agree on all issues. Indeed, one of his daughters was a strident opponent of the Akufo-Addo government. Buzia's daughter opposed the Akufo-Addo government, strident throughout the period. So this family thing, what does it mean? You see, and sometimes we tend to behave in ways which suggest that political acumen can be transferred genetically. It is not transferred genetically. You understand? I mean, political acumen is not transferred genetically. It's just foolish. To think that it's transferred genetically is absolutely foolish. And look at what has happened. One part of the family comes and says, as for us, we are not supporting Brian, we are supporting Bawumia. We didn't mean it. Another side of the family comes and says, we are with Brian Achampo, we are not with Bawumia. What are you doing? Look, if these contestants were focused on policy issues, were focused on how to keep the city stable. They were focused on how to increase food production. They were focused on expanding access to education and so on. They would not be needing Dumbo family and Nkrumah family and Jegrejewu family and so on. They will not be needing that. But they don't have a message. They don't have a plan to salvage this country. So they then descend into the gutter and behave as if it's a dynastic contest. It is not. Let them focus on the real issues.
All right. I think we'll set that as the final word for the guests on the show. I'm trying to see if I can get one or two messages to read on our social media platforms. This one is from Gordon Akwe. It says, we have to put Ghana first. We have a serious situation in Ghana that we have to deal with. We are trying to build our country. We have unemployment issues, Medicare issues, roads issues, and so on. Edwin said the same thing. Said, Kingston Bisnab Asimiga writes, good morning family, watching you live from New York City. Oh, all right, okay. Is it Ashama, New York or American New York? William Nyako writes, it looks like many intellectuals in Ghana are not happy with the progress achieved by the current administration. Nkoko Nkete is just a name and have no impact on the program. All right, so that's what you think. We all have our different views, but others also share different views. Let me do WhatsApp. This one says, good morning, Pan-African Television. My name is Paul. My name is Michael from Spintex Road. President Mahamas renews vow to Ghanaians should be a wake-up call to African leaders because Africa can do everything on their own if only we are willing to make Africa as the best continent. Says God richly blesses at Pan-African Television. God bless you too. I like the man's, this DK from KK, I don't know, is it Kumasi or where? Okay. I like the man's submission on the price of KK being high while the price of staples are reducing. It's unfortunate that most of our leaders think governance means attending big meetings, holding symposiums, example. But the fact is to attend to the fundamental needs of the nationals with the available resources. So the man you are referring to is called Mr. Philip London. Okay. This one says, good morning. Okay, so good morning, just a greeting. Musa Abattoir in Asawasi and Kumasi, Ashanti regions writes, the reports of Kenoforate's detention in the US are a welcome development. The mere fact that he has been evading accountability for his stewardship and desperately seeking US citizenship raises serious questions. If one's hands are clean, there is no need to run for cover or look for scapegoats. Accountability is unavoidable, no matter where one hides. Session greetings to Chief of Staff, Julius Debra. That's from Musa Abattoir in Asanwasi. Let me take this last one and then we'll be out. This one says, dear host, I urge you to read my... Okay, so I just read your